Chapter 21 looks at the 1920s and in particular, this idea that the 1920s has this nickname of the Roaring Twenties, but we'll see, as was the case with the Gilded Age, that all of these wonderful superficial elements that made people both at the time and historically look so fondly on the period also had a whole bunch of unpleasant parts that people would be more than happy to overlook. But our job is to look at the unpleasant parts as much as the pleasant parts. One theme that I want to bring out in chapter 20 is that the decade is A, very, very similar to the modern period, but specifically B, more similar to the present period than it is to the period immediately before. And all of these changes that make the 1920s so much like the 2020s caused a lot of internal conflict within the decade as people were trying to hold on to traditional older ways of life as they were kind of overcome with new technology and social changes that at least a large percentage of people were unhappy with. One example of this is the advent of radio, which is not only an enjoyable source of entertainment, but also fundamentally changes the way that people get their information. Consider that movies didn't exist at the time, so people would maybe read the same novel as other people in the country, but outside of that, people had live stage performances, live music, and all of that varied greatly depending upon the city or the region. Similarly, newspapers, magazines initially started out having very local focuses and being local sources of information, that as the radio becomes more widespread, people get more consistently similar sources of information, right? There's a handful of radio companies that are broadcasting news and entertainment programs across the country. And so that media consolidation is not dissimilar from a handful of companies controlling the information and the entertainment that we have access to nowadays in 2020. Similarly, there are shifts represented in this image, not only with what's considered acceptable or appropriate dress for women. You'll note that she's showing her ankle, which was scandalous and would not have been in publications in previous decades. But it's a little bit hard to read. The text all around her indicates the different elements of her hat and her coat and her blouse and her skirt and her handbag and her stockings and her shoes and her gloves and her pearls and a flower that also lists the prices of all of those things. So this advertisement, if you just changed the exact clothes that she was wearing, would seem very similar in a modern fashion magazine, or maybe even on social media with all the influencers who are selling their own line of fitness, healthcare, beauty, whatever products. And so you have changing attitudes around what is appropriate or acceptable appearances for women, combined not only with consumerism, but then also advertising. Because in addition to radios being the primary form of communication, magazine readership also rose. And as a result, there were a handful of companies that controlled what people bought, what people sold, what people thought was desirable. And that also is part of the shift that makes the 1920s different from earlier decades, and also makes it sound eerily similar to the present day. We had seen earlier that Ford's automobiles were developed in the United States in the preceding decades, but it's during the 1920s that the automobile really picks up. Not only as evidenced by this image that shows the 20 millionth Model T Ford that was constructed, but in particular, the ways in which people bought the Model T, not in the sense of like, oh, you go to a store or a dealership or something like that, but rather that people were buying on credit, right? The 20 million people who bought Model T Fords, did not all of them have cash in hand to just walk to the dealership, hand over the cash and get the car. A significant percentage of them bought it on credit and then paid it off, hopefully over a longer period of time that made the rates low enough for them to afford. But yeah, the principle of buying on credit, and in particular buying because advertising encouraged you to, is a thing that was not as common in the preceding decades, and that is eerily similar to modern day. In particular, the idea that buying on credit is certainly necessary for large purchases, but the idea that people should go into debt and it's natural to have debt, and people should owe tens of thousands of dollars for things that maybe they don't necessarily need is essential to the functioning of the American economy, but it didn't used to be. And a lot of that starts in the 1920s. Similarly, if we look also on this topic of entertainment, you have celebrities like Babe Ruth, who's depicted here, who is not only a renowned athlete, but also is an example of a celebrity. It's worth noting that this earlier image I showed you is of an actress named Clara Bow, who it's not just some random woman who's dressed up in fancy clothes. It's a specific famous woman from movies that you can buy clothes to look like her as well. So there's this idea of celebrity as it pertains to endorsements, because Babe Ruth, in addition to his baseball salary, also had endorsements all over the place, and that was another major source of income for him. Now, baseball had been around since the 1800s, but one of the factors that drives it to be as popular as it was is because baseball is actually really ideally suited for radio broadcasts, right? If you compare it to, say, basketball or football or hockey, those sports, generally speaking, radio announcers have a hard time describing everything that is happening at every single moment. But baseball, based upon its pace, as well as sort of the um, increment of information as each pitch, each contact of bat to ball, all of that information is more kind of suited towards radio. So it's no coincidence that radio and baseball increase in popularity at the same time. And these are all elements that kind of synergize with one another in the 20s, but also that make the popularity of sports. For example, during the COVID pandemic, people have been freaking out about why they don't have all the athletic events that they used to go in person to watch, and the popularity of sports is in some part traced back to the 1920s. Now, at the same time, however, there's a whole array of drawbacks in the late teens, early 20s, one of which is represented by this newspaper headline. You'll remember that at the end of World War I, the United States was afraid of communist infiltration. And so the idea that federal agents are going to arrest 200 Reds, or suspected communist sympathizers, is consistent with America's Red Scare. Now, you'll notice that the Reds and their arrest was specifically related to a coal miners' strike. The problems of labor directly involved with industrialization that had been going on since the Gilded Age were not really resolved. As a result, there's still widespread strikes. And at least in this case, it is no longer necessary for the coal owner in order to hire Pinkertons to break up the strike, because instead, the federal government will do it on their own. And in particular, in 1919, Woodrow Wilson is the president, and his attorney general is a guy named A. Mitchell Palmer. And so the idea that Palmer leads these raids, the phrase that you should be thinking about here is Palmer raids, has a whole bunch of suspected communists, and you'll notice they're being deported. Right, the implication being that the communists are not homegrown American communists; they are immigrant communists who have come to the country, and we don't want them here. So, at the same time as the United States has a concerted effort in order to prevent communism from spreading in the United States, it's inherently and directly tied with anti-immigrant attitudes, which are also encouraged by the Spanish flu. So, one thing to note is that the United States, to a large degree, undercounted the number of deaths as a result of the 1918 flu epidemic. Note that the flu epidemic overlapped with World War I. And so in order to maintain America's war morale, the government and newspapers and radios covered up information about the actual death toll of Americans who died from the flu. The result of not only the United States, but most countries on Earth minimizing the number of deaths was that Spain, the only country that wasn't lying about how many people died from the flu, ends up having its name attached to it. To be clear, the Spanish flu did not originate in Spain. It was not more deadly in Spain. It was simply that the Spanish government did not lie about how many people died. And as a result, that made the rest of the world assume that Spain was actually worse at managing the flu than any other country was. in any case, when the Spanish flu eventually was under control, not through vaccines, but simply through so many people getting sick that enough people were immune, and then also the flu mutating so that it was no longer as severe, not as contagious, and not as deadly. The United States was also done with the war and was more than happy to close off its borders. Right. Remember that the United States was sort of disillusioned and discouraged after World War I. You combine that with fear of communists, you combine that with disease in other countries, and the result is that the United States passes its first non-Chinese Exclusion Act immigration restriction. This image depicts Uncle Sam. You'll notice over here there's a gigantic funnel that has what is effectively an infinite number of Europeans who are trying to cross the Atlantic Ocean to the United States. And he has this gate labeled 3% that is supposed to limit and prevent how many people are coming into the United States. One thing to note is that this Immigration Act, we've already seen lots of examples of anti-immigrant attitudes dating back to the Know Nothing Party and even earlier. But one of the elements that made this Immigration Act particular is that it was based upon the census from earlier years, right? So the idea was that in the preceding decades, more and more immigrants were coming not from Northern and Western Europe, but were instead coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. And the implication is that Southern and Eastern Europeans were less desirable. So to make sure that the country not only stayed the way it was, but actually went back to the way it used to be, America thought it was necessary to have quotas on national origin, but that those quotas should be based upon what the country's demographics used to be like, right? This was an intentional effort to return America's immigrant population and demographics to previous generations. The effect of this Immigration Act is shown in this chart. The full name, Immigration Act of 1924, was the Johnson-Reed Act, but you don't have to remember that part. And you'll see that in the preceding decades, the percentage of Americans who are foreign born varied anywhere between 9.7% up to a high of 14.8, but it kind of fluctuated 13, 14, 13, 15, 13, 15, 13. But after the 1924 Act, there was a severe drop off in immigration to a record low of less than 5% of the American population being foreign born in the 1970 census. Note that that changes directly as a result of the 1965 Immigration Act. We'll come back to that later, obviously, when we get to that chapter. But you'll note that the vast majority, not only in the country and not only in San Francisco, but specifically at Washington High School, in fact, this could potentially apply to you as an individual, and if not you, to your classmates, most people whose families came to the United States, they came to the United States after 1965, specifically because of this pattern, right? This law creates a strict quota system that limits how many immigrants are allowed in, and that causes a severe drop. And then after this Immigration Act, it takes literally decades, but the percent foreign-born population returns not even to its peak, but simply to kind of the mid-level it was in the late 1800s, and it's remained there all the way up until the present. So the consequence and the effect of the Immigration Act is not only to lower the overall number of immigrants, but to limit from most places, but effectively have nearly unlimited immigration from more desirable Northern and Western European regions until the 65 Immigration Act undoes the quotas and makes it easier to immigrate to the United States rather than harder. This is part of a larger broader movement in the 1920s that makes the United States more conservative. Over here, we have the president and vice president, and then later president in the 1920s. On the left, you have Calvin Coolidge, who underneath him, it says law and order, in addition to being a police procedural television show, is also a slogan that is used specifically by mostly Republican politicians. Both these are Republicans, and we'll come back in a moment, but I argue that these presidents in the 1920s really come to define a lot of the elements that the Republican Party still believes today, 100 years later. You'll also see on the right Warren G. Harding with a phrase underneath him, America First, and not only Donald Trump, although he's certainly one, but many Republican presidents have used law and order, i.e. protests and riots and demonstrations. Those things are un-American, and America should not worry about other countries. we should care about America first, that attitude is consistent throughout Republican politics for the last 100 years. Calvin Coolidge, his nickname was Silent Calvin, and that nickname comes from a story that may or may not have actually happened, but at least the story goes that a woman at a party bet her husband or bet her friends that she could get Calvin Coolidge to say more than 3 words, and his response was "you lose," which is ha 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 funny because he only said 2 words. But what's more important than how many words Calvin Coolidge said in a given day was, in contrast, what his policies were and what his presidency was like. And one of the things to note is that, in contrast to the earlier period, for example, during the Progressive era, you remember that not only city and state governments, but the federal government were much more active, right? There were regulations, there was anti-monopolistic efforts, there were reforms, all of them done by the government, in many cases by the federal government. So when the Republican presidents of the 1920s reject that attitude and say, no, actually, the government is going to do very, very little, that is consistent with the last 100 years, where the Republican Party has consistently said the federal government should do very little, and either state governments or private charities or companies, some other institution or organization should do more, and the federal government should do less. And so it's for that comparison that the mention of Calvin Coolidge saying very little is more broadly not about his personal speaking habits, but instead about his view of the role of government and how much he should do and what he should say as president. As one consequence and one example of the movement away from regulation in the 1920s, there's multiple examples of scandals. There's actually a high-profile baseball scandal involving bribery. But if we're looking at by far the most well-known, that is the Teapot Dome oil scandal. Teapot Dome was a location which there are questions about who should be able to drill there for oil. And there's embezzlement and bribery that was widely reported, but the country was sort of over with this whole progressive reform, regulation, anti-corruption thing, and there was not widespread anti-corruption reforms in response to the Teapot Dome scandal. So this is by no means the only example, but it is one to demonstrate that when the country moved away from the progressive anti-corruption efforts, there was widespread corruption. It's kind of hard to see, but you'll notice that there's a guy over here in the back who's already been run over, and there's a guy here who's in the process of being run over. And these guys are fleeing on the way to the White House because the corruption went definitely within the president's cabinet, and historians still disagree on exactly how high the scandal went. The 1920s also sees prohibition. You'll remember that the anti-alcohol efforts were directly tied with anti-immigrant efforts, and that was not new. It's also the same thing during the temperance movement. But with the progressive era and the idea of outlawing alcohol to stop alcoholism and domestic abuse and unemployment and all the problems that go with it, this image shows a whole bunch of people pouring alcohol out onto the street to be flushed down the drain rather than people drinking it. Historians disagree exactly how much drinking increased or decreased during Prohibition. There's some estimates that say that people actually drank more because it became cool and edgy and like the hip thing to do. Other historians argue that that's overinflated, and actually most people followed the law and didn't drink alcohol. It's not entirely clear, but Prohibition is directly tied to the 1920s, in part because pretty early on in the 1930s, the country legalizes alcohol again, partially to generate tax revenue during the Great Depression. One of the clearest drawbacks of Prohibition was the rise in organized crime. Right? People who wanted to continue drinking could no longer buy it at the store, and so they had to buy it from the mob. So, for example, Al Capone in Chicago and other organized crime figures elsewhere in the country made a lot of money, which they had already been making on protection rackets and illegal lotteries, but with a gigantic revenue stream in the form of supplying alcohol to people who wanted it, even though it was illegal. That also led to a rise in organized crime that doesn't really go away until the 1930s and arguably not even until the 40s. The 1920s also sees a rise in women's rights, specifically with the 19th Amendment and women getting the right to vote. You'll note that this woman, who is standing next to her, this sign uses the word Kaiser to refer to Wilson rather than president. Kaiser is the German word for emperor. Curiously, it actually comes from the same root as czar, which is the Latin word Caesar. And so the idea that an American woman is going to use the German word for emperor to talk about Wilson in the middle of World War I is her using particular choices, knowing her audience and knowing the context that is trying to draw a connection between Germany being an undemocratic country, and in particular with Wilson claiming that World War I was being fought to make the world safe for democracy. And so this argument, as along with others, were successful in convincing Congress in order to pass the 19th Amendment and grant women the right to vote. Note that this was not done, with the whole country just waking up one morning and being like, "Oh gosh, I guess women should have the right to vote." It literally passed by one vote, and only as a result of decades of protest and struggle. It was not uncommon for women who demanded the right to vote to go on hunger strikes, to be imprisoned and force-fed, and that is part of the struggle in order to get women the right to vote. Note that when the 19th Amendment is passed, it's specifically white women who get the right to vote, because women of color, as with men of color, are still subject to literacy tests and poll taxes in most parts of the country that prevent them from voting because of their race. And so the 19th Amendment had the most direct effect on white women being able to vote, as opposed to women of all races. The 1920s also sees the rise of family planning, as evidenced by Margaret Sanger, who's the founder of organization Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood is still around today, but the idea that families, and in particular mothers, should have any kind of influence over whether they have any children, or in particular, a lot of families should have additional children. Margaret Sanger saw lots of families where the husband and the wife already have 5 kids, and if the family has a 6th or a 7th or an 8th or a 9th or a 10th, they won't be able to afford it. So the idea was to try to limit births so that families have control over it. Now, it is worth noting that Margaret Sanger believed in eugenics. And to be clear, I am not saying that Planned Parenthood today in 2021 believes in eugenics. But it is true that Margaret Sanger, along with many public intellectuals in the 1920s, believed that some people's genes were strictly better than other people's genes. And this was a billboard that was put up at a sort of a convention. The text in the middle very clearly reads, "Some people are born to be a burden to the rest." On the left here, it reads, "This light flashes every 16 seconds. Every 16 seconds, a person is born in the United States." You'll notice over here, the text reads, "Fitter Families Contest." This was a contest to try to encourage families with good genes to have kids. This light flashes every 7.5 minutes. Every 7.5 minutes, a high-grade person is born in the United States who will have the ability to do creative work and be fit for leadership. About 4% of all Americans come within this class. This light flashes every 15 seconds. Every 15 seconds, $100 of your money goes for the care of persons with bad heredity, such as the insane, feeble-minded, criminals, and other defectives. So this idea that some people have better genes than others, and going back to Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger was motivated in part by a desire to have people with bad genes have fewer children, ideally none. And in contrast, people who have the best genes should have more kids to try to improve the quality of the people on Earth. So you'll note there's a direct connection between this and the Immigration Act of 1924, right? Some people are better than others. We should have as many of the good people and as few of the bad people as possible. You also may have recognized some elements of eugenics with the Nazis' ideology around race purity. And that's because Germany was reading the same fake scientific journals that Americans were. And at least to some degree, Germany's racial purity laws were based upon American laws, not only in the case of eugenics, but also in the case of racial discrimination in the Jim Crow South. So again, just to make sure we're 100% clear here, I am in no way saying that Planned Parenthood nowadays believes in eugenics, but it is true that this is a widespread belief in America in the 1920s, not only in people putting up billboards in random places, but also in the United States Supreme Court. Because in 1927, and I'm not going to read the full text of this, I'm assuming that you all can read this as I'm talking, the Supreme Court decides that throughout the United States, it is legal for health agencies to decide that people with disabilities are not fit to have children and forcibly sterilize them. It uses in context this idea, the best citizens for their lives. That's a reference to World War I and military service. It also has a reference to vaccinations, which were increasingly common in the early 1900s. But this idea that the state has a responsibility and has the power to not only draft people into a war and not only force people to get vaccines, but can also take people who are undesirable in some way and surgically prevent them from having children at any point during their life, is a practice that is common in the United States well into the 20th century. It should not be a surprise to see that this practice was done in a racist fashion. It was more commonly performed among people of color than it was among white people. And it's also worth noting that it was much more common for women to be sterilized more so than men. So this is a part of American history that, especially after World War II, the United States is more than happy to pretend never happened. But this is part of the ideology in the 1920s that drives a lot of the policy choices that the country makes. On the topic of science, but in a very, very different direction, the country is in the process of trying to decide whether evolution should be taught. And this is an issue nationwide, but specifically in the case of a teacher named John Scopes, he's put on trial for teaching evolution. Evolution at this point was not as well scientifically supported as it is nowadays, but it definitely had scientific support. But individual cities and counties were able to decide what could happen in their schools, what their curriculum would be. And John Scopes was ultimately found guilty. Although, as a result of the news coverage, in particular radio coverage of the trial, it changed some number of Americans' point of view to be more favorable towards evolution. So one way to think about it is that Scopes lost the trial, but more broadly, in the attitude of the country, he made evolution more of an acceptable idea. One comparison to make that I pointed out to third period because somebody asked and was surprising to me for sure, is that as recently as 2019, 40% of Americans believed in creationism. In other words, they believed in a literal interpretation of the Bible in such that humans did not evolve. Humans were created by God literally as the Bible described. There's 33% of Americans who believe that evolution happened, but evolution happened with God's influence. And there's 22% who believe that evolution happened with no influence from God at all. And again, this is from 2019. The same questions and issues that are around during the 1920s don't disappear. They simply kind of fade in and out and then take different forms in the modern day. The 1920s also sees the Harlem Renaissance, and while a lot of people get credit for their artistic output, as they should, one person who doesn't get the credit that he deserves is Alain Leroy Locke, who at the time was credited as being the father of the Harlem Renaissance. He wrote a book called The New Negro, as sort of a essay arguing that Black American artists should be inspiring one another and collaborating and focusing on creating art that was not rooted in slavery, but that was a more kind of modern, new style of art, in particular Northern versus Southern. And it was in part because of his influence that dozens of artists collaborated with dozens of others in a wide variety of creative endeavors that does not improve the quality of life, for example, of sharecroppers in the South, but does demonstrate to white and other non-Black audiences that Black artists are capable of creating great art. You'll notice that under community leaders, they have W.E.B. Du Bois listed over here because he's still around into the 1920s and is active still with the NAACP. I mentioned that because you recall that Du Bois had the idea that the NAACP was going to be the solution, the way to get equality for Black Americans, in contrast to Booker T. Washington, who argued that gradually they could economically do it through Tuskegee University. In the 1920s, there's a third approach, which is represented by Marcus Garvey. He leads what he calls the Back to Africa movement. Note that by this point, nearly all Black Americans in the 1920s were born there, maybe the grandchildren, maybe the 4 times great-grandchildren of people who had come from Africa. But Garvey is speaking kind of metaphorically about the place where their ancestors came from. So his policy, his plan that he advocated for, was that Black Americans should go to Africa because they would never be treated fairly in the United States. Ultimately, he's not super successful. Historians still disagree on whether Marcus Garvey actually embezzled money or if he was just framed and accused of embezzling money. But ultimately, he is not able to mobilize support in the same way, for example, that the African Colonization Society was in the early 1800s, which the ACS founded Liberia, and Marcus Garvey did not, found a country similarly. It may be a surprise, although in brief reflection, it should not be, that one of the foremost advocates for Marcus Garvey was the KKK. And this is a photo from them having a march demonstration in Washington, D.C. That's the Capitol building in the background. And the KKK, as you might imagine, was supportive of Marcus Garvey because they too believed that Black people should leave America. The KKK is more popular in the 1920s than at any point since Reconstruction. And the shift is that the KKK, in addition to hating Black people, also hates Jews, also hates Catholics, and in particular hates immigration. So the KKK is one of the groups that advocates and agitates most effectively for the 1924 Immigration Act. And so at the same time as people are like, wow, the 1920s were great because of the fashion and the prohibition and the drinking, it also was peak membership of the KKK. And it's very easy to gloss over that and just focus on the kind of superficial, flashy elements of the 1920s and leave out the racism and stuff part. America's foreign policy is very limited during the 1920s. They hold a naval conference in Washington with a bunch of other countries invited. And the primary purpose of this conference was to limit how many ships various combatants were allowed to have in different seas and oceans. So Washington is willing to host this conference, but for the express purpose of meeting one time, limiting how many ships people can have, and then never seeing each other again, right? There's no enforcement. There's no implication that they're going to, check back in with each other. And so this one meeting is designed for the express purpose of making sure that future wars are avoided, right? Because if every country agrees to limit the number of ships they have, war is less likely. And so this one very, very limited instance of America's foreign policy in the 20s is designed to prevent future international involvement. Similarly, Congress agrees to a treaty negotiated called the Kellogg-Briand Treaty. This headline doesn't mention Briand, strangely. Briand was the French diplomat. But the Kellogg-Briand Treaty is representative of, again, America's very limited foreign policy, because this is a treaty that simply says wars of aggression are bad. There's no enforcement, there's no follow-up, there's no anything that could resemble an obligation on America's part. So America is willing to meet one time to say, hey guys, we shouldn't have ships, and then have no follow through. They're willing to sign a treaty that says war is bad and have no follow through. So there's kind of half-hearted attempts in order to prevent another world war, but nothing lasting, nothing significant, and nothing that costs or even inconveniences the United States in any way. Just the most kind of minimal struggles possible. And it's at this point that I want to introduce this guy, Herbert Hoover. He's the president of the United States at the tail end of the 1920s, and who serves as president, unfortunately for him, during the start of the Great Depression. And Americans in the 1930s, and for the most part all the way up until today, remember Herbert Hoover as this gigantic loser. who not only mismanaged the response to the Great Depression, but made a conscious choice to do nothing. As people were starving across the entire country, he was like, well, I don't know, man, like, what can the government do? And Hoover ultimately felt like his hands were tied. But in the 19 teens and 1920s, Herbert Hoover was a hero. He was single-handedly responsible for organizing food donations and distribution to Belgium and elsewhere in Europe that was devastated by World War I. Estimates say that he was responsible for saving at least tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands or millions of lives as a result of the widespread famine at the end of World War I. And his food distribution efforts, if his public career had stopped at that point, he would have statues built to him all over the place because of his great humanitarian contributions. And so when he gets elected president at the end of the 1920s, people expect him to, oversee continued economic growth as had been happening during the 20s. And we'll see next week exactly how and why and where everything falls apart. But just remember that Herbert Hoover, for the first half of his life, had contributed a great deal, not only to America, but to people all over the world. And it's not until after the Great Depression that his political career ends up taking a turn for the worse.